So now we're going to look at loops. There are two types of loops. There are while loops and there are for loops. While loops are basically loops that continue to iterate or loop as long as a condition evaluates to true. In contrast, for loops will be ran on all elements like in an iterable. So here in this example, we're basically setting a variable equal to, the variable I equal to 14. So initiating the while loop, we use the while keyword. So we say while I is greater than 7, print I. And then at the end of each loop, we just subtract 1 from I. So basically what's going to happen here is it'll throw in 14, it'll print 14. Then it'll subtract 1, so you get 13. Then 13 is still greater than 7, so it'll print 13. Then it'll subtract out 1 and get 12. And it'll continue until it gets down to 7, and at that point it'll say the logic will be 7 is greater than 7, which is not true, and the while loop will exit or stop. So if we run this, we will get back that. So 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, and then once I is 7, it's no longer, this criteria is no longer met, and thus the while loop stops. One of the issues with while loops is that you can have what's known as an infinite loop, and that's where the condition will never evaluate to false. So in this example, how I could cause that to happen is I could change this to plus equals. So then it's always going to get bigger. It's never going to be less than 7, so thus the loop will continue indefinitely. And the only way to stop it is to manually stop the program, or your computer runs out of memory or something. So that can be a bit dangerous. So I'm not going to run that because that would cause some issues. So whenever you create while loops, just make sure that you don't have logic that will never evaluate to false, and thus you'll get an infinite loop. I tend to not use while loops a lot. Instead, I generally use for loops, and for loops are used a lot. So this is something you should make sure that you have a grasp over. So in contrast to a while loop, what a for loop does is it allows you to loop through each element in an object that is iterable. So this could be each character in a string, it could be each element in a list, each element in a tuple, something like that. So real quick, this is an example. So I'm creating a list with some numbers in it, and then I'm going to do for I in list 1, print value is colon space and then the value. Note that since these are numbers, I have to wrap it in the string function there because you can't concatenate an integer to a string. So if I run this, basically it just prints the value is equal to value is and then the value until it runs out of elements in the list. Again, other iterable objects would work. So if I made this a tuple, again I'm just replacing this with parentheses, it would still work because both tuples and lists are iterable type objects. Another thing that people sometimes get confused with when you first start playing around with loops and whatnot is this concept of sorry, let's train of thought for a second. What I is. So I is just another variable. So it doesn't have to be I. So I could change this to like for num in list 1, but I have to change this also to num, and that would still work. So again, I is just kind of the standard that people use, but it's not necessary. It's just a variable. So you can use whatever variable name you want as long as it's not already used, or it's a legitimate variable name, and it has to match. So if I would change this down here to I, here it just prints 13, which is weird, and that's because the last time I ran this, it ended on 13. So I is currently 13, so it just iterates through the numbers in the list, but it's always just printing I, which was what I used to be. So if I would do something like do I is equal to 0, then it's just going to print 0 for each of the units. So just make sure they match. So num in list, and then here we're going to put this num. Okay, another type of iterable object is a string, or a character type, or a string object. So here we have a string, so it's just a course name here. And in this case, instead of iterating over elements in an iterable or elements in a list, so in this case numbers in a list, we're iterating over each character in a string. So all it's going to do here is for each C, which I used for character in the string, it's just going to print it. So it just prints all those values separately. All right, let's do something else real quick. I'm gonna create a new list. I'm gonna do list1 is equal to list, and this just initiates an empty list. So now what I'm gonna do is, instead of doing a print in here, what I'm gonna do is we're gonna do an append. So we'll do list1 dot append, and we'll append C to the list. And then when we're done with this, we'll just print back the list. Okay, so let's see if this works. Ooh, yeah, that worked. Okay, so what this basically did this time was I created a character object, or character a string object there. Then I created an empty list. Now instead of printing each element in each character in the string, it just appends that character to the list, and then I print the list. So you can see that now each element, including the space in the string, is now an individual element inside of the list, right? Okay, so this becomes more powerful when you combine loops with flow control. So this means that you could have, for example, something different happen based on conditions for each element in an iterable. So here we have, again, a list of values. Then again, that's iterable. So we create a for loop, and now we're going to have different results depending on whether a condition is true or false. So if it's less than 8, it'll print is less than 8. If it's equal to 8, it'll print equal to 8, and then if it's greater than 8, which is the only other option, so what's an else, it'll print greater than 8. So now if we run through that, it prints a different result for each of the numbers that are in the list, so within the iterable list. And that logic should work, right? So this is combining a for loop and flow control so that something different happens for each element in an iterable, or in this case, each number included in a list. This is kind of a similar example here, though instead of using a number, I'm using a list of strings here. So here it just goes through and prints those out. This is showing specifically this concept of range. So range is a function in Python. So before we run this, let's just have a look at what range does. So we'll just do range of, and then I'll just put in a number here. So we'll just put in 11. So this creates this range object, which is the values 0 through 11. Basically. All right, so then here, when we run that, then basically what this is doing is we're doing for I in range, which is over the length of counties. So the length would be 10 in this case. Then it's going to print, or sorry, that's wrong. It's going to be, well, actually, let's look at it. We'll run this with, we'll do print length of counties. And we'll run this. So let's just run this and see what happens. Oops. What did I do wrong? Oh, sorry, it should be countries. Sorry. So countries. There we go. So this is a length of 4. So, yeah. So it basically returns those values. So we go for I in range length of this. So basically through 4. It's going to grab the county at that index, so the index I, so it'll start at, at 0, work its way up, and then it's just going to print out that county as part of this concatenated string. So anyway, you see range used a lot along with for loops, and that's generally when you want to iterate over the index as opposed to over the value, which is what this does. Another option that you sometimes see used with for loops is enumerate. So what enumerate does is it allows you to generate not just pull the value, but also create an index for the value. So whenever you use enumerate on an object, you can get it, it'll return back the index and also the value. So let's just real quick before we run this, I'm just going to create another code block, and I'm going to do enumerate counties and just see what happens. So we'll hit run there. Sorry, countries. Hit run there, and we get this enumerate object. And I'm just going to put in, let's do print and see what it does. Oh, so it just prints the object. Might not be able to actually get that back. Basically what it does, though, is for each of these, it's going to return an index and also the value. So it would be like 0 in Belgium, 1 in Mexico, 3 and 2 in Italy, so on and so forth. And what's important with that in the concept of loops is that means that you can have access to both the index and the value within the loop. So here we got for the index and the country in enumerate countries. So each of these will return, again, an index and a country. If the index is not divisible by 2, so if it's odd, then it'll print I would like to visit 2, and then if it doesn't, it'll print I would not like to visit 2. Sorry, actually, I said backwards. If you divide by 2 and there's a remainder of 0, so if it's an even index, then it'll print back this, and thus, if it's an odd index, it'll print back what's in the else statement. So you can see that here. So 0 index, 1 index, 2 index, 3 index. Alright, so anyway, that's the whole concept of using for loops that allows you to iterate over objects in an iterable object, and that includes things like tuples, lists, and also characters within a string. And then sometimes if you want to use the indexes within the for loop, you can make use of the range argument here, and you can also make use of enumerate, which will return both the index and the actual value. And then you can call the index and the value within the content of the loop, which is useful.